Who built the American West? Ask that question and you'll probably hear the same answer over and over. The cowboy. And it's an understandable answer. The cowboy is one of the most recognizable figures in American history. A rider beneath a wide-brimmed hat. A horse, open country, hard work, independence. But the further you ride into the history of the West, the more people you begin to meet. People who spoke different languages. People who came from different continents. People who arrived centuries apart. Some came willingly, others had no choice. Some crossed the plains horseback, others on foot. Some drove cattle or laid railroad track, opened stores, raised families, or protected settlements. Some have lived on the land for thousands of years before anyone else arrived, and all of them left something behind. History has a funny way of simplifying itself. The further away we stand from it, the fewer faces we remember. Because the American West wasn't built by one kind of person. It became what it is because countless lives became braided together, one strand at a time. Howdy, Chip Schweiger here. Welcome to another edition of Way Out West, where the stories of the American West are told, cowboy wisdom is earned, and the legacy of the American cowboy still rides on. The American West has never belonged to a single story. It stretches from windswept prairies to desert mesas, from snow-covered mountain passes to quiet ranch valleys, where dawn still begins with the sound of horses and the smell of fresh coffee. Every canyon, every trail, every weathered fence line holds echoes of the people who came before us. Some are remembered, many are not, but together they built something far greater than any one legend could ever tell. Today's journey begins there. Before we saddle up, you'll find photographs, maps, and additional resources for today's episode in the show notes at wayoutwestpod.com/Who Built the West. Welcome back. For a long time, I've thought about today's question. Who built the American West? Not who became famous, not who appeared in movies, or ended up in the history books more often than everyone else, but who actually built it. Because the truth is, history usually isn't built by one extraordinary person. It's built by thousands of ordinary people whose stories eventually become tangled together. That's especially true in the American West. When we picture the West, it's easy to imagine a single rider crossing an endless landscape. It's a beautiful image. It's also incomplete. The real West looked more like a busy stockyard than a lonely prairie. People coming and going, different languages filling the air, wagons arriving, freight being unloaded, children running down dusty streets. A blacksmith's hammer ringing through town. Someone leading a string of mules, someone else driving cattle, maybe a train whistle in the distance. History didn't happen one person at a time. It happened all at once. And maybe that's why it can be so hard to untangle. Or maybe, instead of untangling it, we should think of it as something braided together. There's an old piece of cowboy gear called a riata. Traditionally, it was braided from strips of rawhide. By themselves, those strips weren't especially remarkable, but braided together, they became incredibly strong. I've started thinking about the American West the same way. Every people, every culture, every generation, another strand in that braid. Imagine it's early morning somewhere in the West, say 1885. The sun has barely climbed above the horizon. A ranch wife has already been awake for an hour. Coffee is on the stove, biscuits are in the oven, children are beginning to stir. Outside, a cowboy tightens his cinch before heading toward a herd grazing just beyond town. Across the street, a merchant unlocks the front door of his store. A blacksmith is lighting his forge. The depot agent glances down at the tracks, waiting for the morning train. Before long, riders begin drifting into town. Some are trailing cattle, some have freight to pick up, and some are simply buying flour, nails, coffee, lamp oil before heading home. It feels ordinary because it was. None of those people probably believed they were building the American West. They were just living another Tuesday. And history is funny that way. It's usually built out of ordinary mornings. If we're going to understand who built the West, we have to begin long before there were cattle towns, long before railroads, before wagon trains, or even before anyone called this place the American West, because people already knew this country. For thousands of years, indigenous nations have learned every corner of these landscapes through generations of experience. They knew where water could be found after a dry summer. They understood which grasses fed animals best and which mountain passes remained open the longest. When rivers flooded, when buffalo moved, which plants healed, which plants harmed. Knowledge like that isn't gathered in a lifetime. It's gathered across centuries. Different nations understood different landscapes. The Comanche became extraordinary horsemen of the southern plains. The Nez Perce developed one of the finest horse cultures in North America. The Apache learned to survive in country that could seem impossibly harsh to outsiders. Out here, knowing where water was could mean the difference between reaching tomorrow or not reaching it at all. The Navajo built lives shaped by both farming and livestock in the Southwest. Every landscape taught different lessons. Every people adapted differently. That's one of the oldest strands in the braid. Over time, new people began arriving from across the Atlantic. Some came searching for wealth, others for opportunity, and others simply because kings and empires had their own ambitions. Spanish explorers first entered what is now the American Southwest in the 1500s. Some came searching for cities of gold. Others came for empire. Some established missions. Others founded settlements that would grow into places still familiar today. What people often miss is that they weren't simply passing through. They brought livestock, horses, cattle, sheep, new farming practices, European tools, new legal systems, new architecture, new ideas. Some of those ideas blended with existing traditions. Others created conflict that still echoes today. History is rarely tidy. It almost never unfolds exactly the way anyone expects. But whether they realize it or not, the Spanish introduced animals that would permanently reshape the West, especially one, the horse. Now I should pause here because sometimes people say the Spanish brought horses to America, and that's true, but it's only part of the story. Once horses escaped and were traded, they spread far beyond Spanish settlements. Indigenous nations adopted them with astonishing speed. Within a few generations, entire cultures had transformed. Mobility changed, hunting changed, trade changed, warfare changed, daily life changed. The horse didn't belong to one people anymore. It became part of many cultures. And that's another strand in the braid. The same thing happened with cattle. Spanish cattle adapted remarkably well to the dry country of the Southwest. Generations later, their descendants would become Texas Longhorns. Those hardy animals could survive conditions that challenged many European breeds. And with cattle came people whose job it was to care for them, the vaqueros. If you've listened to this podcast for very long, you've heard me say this before. The American cowboy didn't suddenly appear one morning wearing a Stetson and carrying a six-shooter. Like most things in history, he evolved. The vaqueros of New Spain and later Mexico developed generations of practical knowledge about managing cattle from horseback. Not because they were trying to invent the cowboy, but because they were trying to get a difficult job done. They refined saddles, ropes, bits, spurs, branding techniques, roundups, horsemanship, all of it. Much of it reflected earlier traditions from Spain, adapted to a completely different landscape. Then, over generations, those practices blended again with local experience. That's how history usually works, not through a single invention, but through constant refinement. Even today, the fingerprints remain. Words we use without thinking: rodeo, bronco, mustang, lariat, cinch, corral. They're quiet reminders that cultures leave traces behind. Sometimes those traces are still hiding in everyday conversation, and that's another strand in the braid. And here's something that always makes me smile. The first time many Eastern cowboys headed south into Texas after the Civil War, they didn't just have to learn a new country, they had to learn new words. Suddenly, everyone was talking about remudas and chaparreras and bosals and riatas. The language itself reminded them that they were entering a ranching culture that had been taking shape for generations. When the United States expanded westward during the 19th century, it inherited far more than open land. It inherited ideas, skills, animals, trails, communities, and ways of working that had already been evolving for generations. The American cowboy didn't replace the vaquero, he learned from him. On ranches across Texas and the Southwest, traditions mixed together. An American ranch hand might throw a loop using techniques that had been refined over generations by those Mexican vaqueros. He might ride a horse descended from Spanish stock, work cattle whose ancestors first arrived centuries earlier, and use equipment whose design reflected influences from half a world away. History isn't a relay race where one group hands the baton to another. It's more like a river. Streams flow together until after a while, it's impossible to separate them. And that's another strand in the braid. Of course, when most people picture the American cowboy today, they usually picture one person, a white man riding alone across an empty landscape. Hollywood gave us that image. But the working cowboy was far more varied than the legend. Historians estimate that roughly 1 in 4 cowboys after the Civil War was black. Others were Mexican, some were indigenous, many were recent immigrants. Most weren't looking for adventure, they were looking for work. The job itself didn't care much where you were born. If you could stay in the saddle, handle cattle, pull your weight, and be trusted by the crew, you had a place. Now that doesn't mean prejudice disappeared. It certainly didn't. But on a long trail drive, competence has a way of speaking louder than pride. The cattle still had to reach market, and every hand mattered. Picture a trail crew pushing 2,000 head north towards Kansas. Dust so thick that you can't see the rider beside you. Thunderheads building on the horizon. 12 or 15 cowboys spread across the herd. Chances are, one or more of them was black. Most people watching a Western movie never realize that. One of those hands belonged to Nat Love. If you've listened to Way Out West for a while, you know I'm a big fan of his autobiography. Love was born into slavery in Tennessee and after emancipation headed west as a young man. He became an accomplished cowboy, worked trail drives, and later wrote about his experiences in a memoir that remains one of the great first-hand accounts of cowboy life. Was every story in his book polished a little? Probably. Cowboys have been known to improve a story around a campfire. But beneath the storytelling is something important. His life reminds us that the cowboy story was never as narrow as popular culture might make it seem. And that's another strand in the braid. And while the cowboys were out riding the range, someone else was keeping the ranch alive. I've always thought ranch wives deserve far more attention than they usually receive. Because ranches weren't sustained by cowboys alone. They were sustained by families. Women often managed the household, raised children, kept gardens, prepared meals for crews, tended livestock close to home, managed accounts, ordered supplies, nursed injuries. Sometimes they rode alongside the men. Sometimes they ran the entire operation when circumstances demanded it. Life on the frontier didn't leave much room for idle hands. Everybody worked. Frontier women came from every background you can imagine. Some were born in cities, some crossed oceans, they were indigenous or Hispanic. Some arrived in covered wagons, others lived in the region for generations. Different stories, same determination. Another strand. Then came the railroads. Now here's something we don't talk about very often. The great cattle drives only lasted for a relatively short period of time. Why? Because the railroad kept moving west. Every time the tracks advanced, the trail got shorter. Eventually, the cattle didn't need to walk hundreds of miles anymore. They could be loaded onto rail cars much closer to where they were raised. The railroad didn't end the cattle business, it changed it. And building those railroads required astonishing effort. Thousands upon thousands of laborers, Irish immigrants, Civil War veterans, freedmen, and Chinese workers whose contribution was enormous but far too often overlooked. Many of them blasted tunnels through solid granite. Now imagine lowering yourself over a granite wall in nothing more than a woven basket, carrying drills, black powder, and the hope that rope above you holds. They worked in brutal winters, faced avalanches, explosives, accidents. Imagine standing in the Sierra Nevada with hand drills, black powder, and a mountain standing in your way. It's difficult enough to build a railroad with modern equipment. Imagine doing it one hammer blow at a time. Without those railroads, the West develops very differently. And that's another strand in the braid. The same could be said for the homesteaders. Some succeeded, many didn't. The Homestead Act offered opportunity. It didn't promise comfort. Families arrived full of hope. Then came drought, grasshoppers, blizzards, isolation, crop failures, debt. The prairie could be breathtakingly beautiful. It could also be heartbreakingly unforgiving. And yet, people stayed. They planted windbreaks, built schools, started churches, raised barns, dug wells, and planted orchards. One generation struggled, the next often benefited. And that's how communities grow, one season at a time. Of course, no town survives very long without businesses. It's easy to celebrate the rancher, but somebody had to sell him fence wire. Somebody sharpened his tools, repaired wagons, printed newspapers, ran the banks, operated hotels, opened cafes, sold coffee, stocked flour. Those little mercantiles that still survive in historic Western towns weren't just charming buildings, they were lifelines. I've always smiled at the old general stores. Walk in for a sack of beans, you walk out with a shovel and a pair of boots and lamp oil and a spool of thread and peppermint sticks for the kids and probably the latest gossip from 3 counties. Amazon has nothing on an old Western mercantile. Every town needed people who could keep commerce moving. Another strand. And then there were the people whose job was to bring some measure of order to places that often grew faster than anyone expected. Soldiers built forts, surveyors mapped land, engineers designed bridges, stagecoach drivers carried mail, and telegraph operators stitched distant communities together with a single wire. Lawmen, well, sometimes they kept the peace and sometimes they struggled to find it. The truth is the frontier wasn't nearly as lawless as Hollywood liked to portray. Most people simply wanted safe streets, reliable mail, a functioning courthouse, and someone who would show up if trouble found its way to town. Civilizations aren't built only by dramatic moments. They're built by dependable people doing ordinary jobs, day after day, year after year. When you step back from all of it, something remarkable begins to appear. No single strand explains the American West. Not the cowboy, not the vaquero, not the rancher, not the railroad, not the homesteader, not the merchant, the soldier, or the ranch wife. Not even the indigenous nations who knew these landscapes so deeply. Take away any one of them and the story changes. The braid becomes weaker. History has a way of tempting us towards simple answers. Simple answers fit on bumper stickers. They fit in movie scripts. They fit neatly into little chapters in school books. Real history almost never does. It's messier than that, richer than that, more human than that. And I think that's good news, because the real story is almost always more interesting than the legend. Maybe that's why the American West still captures our imagination. It isn't because it belonged to one kind of person. It never did. It isn't because everyone agreed, because they certainly didn't. The West was built through cooperation, conflict, exchange, adaptation, persistence, generation after generation, one strand joining another until something remarkably strong emerged, like a braided riata, strong enough to pull together things that seemed impossible to hold. The American West isn't remarkable because one group built it. It's remarkable because so many different people left something of themselves behind. Some left trails, others left towns, great ranches, songs, recipes. Some left words we still speak. Some left fences that still stand. Some left stories that are only now beginning to be fully told. And here's the part I love the most. The story isn't finished. Somewhere this morning before sunrise, a ranch hand saddled a horse. Somewhere else, a tribal elder shared a story with a grandchild, mouth to ear. A freight train crossed the plains. A family unlocked the doors of a small-town hardware store. Someone fixed a fence. A group of folks branded calves. Someone else swept the porch of a century-old mercantile. The tools have changed. Some of the names have changed, but people are still adding strands. The West was never just a place. It's always been a living story. Maybe that's the greatest lesson the American West has to offer. We inherit stories the same way we inherit land. Not so that we can keep them exactly as we found them, but so we can understand them more completely than the generation before us. Every generation discovers another voice, another diary, another photograph, another piece of the puzzle. Not because history changes, but because our understanding of it grows. The braid becomes clearer. And that's a good thing, because the real American West has always been far richer and far more interesting than the simplified version we sometimes remember. Okay, before we ride out today, we've got just one more thing. Yep, that distinctive call from Buster the Bull means it's time again for our cowboy glossary term of the week. And this week's term is riata. So a little bit more about the riata. It's traditionally a braided rawhide rope used by vaqueros long before the modern nylon rope became common. Braiding several narrow strips of rawhide together created a rope that was remarkably strong, durable, and dependable. Seems fitting, doesn't it? Because that's how the American West was built. Not by one strand, but by many, braided together. Well, that's all for this episode of Way Out West. Thanks for riding with me here. If you've enjoyed the episode, please follow, rate, and share the show with someone who loves the history, culture, and traditions of the American West. And if you'd like to see more of the work we're doing, you can visit ridewayoutwest.com. There you'll find articles, a mercantile, the podcast archive, and more resources for fans of the American West. That's ridewayoutwest.com. Until next time, this is Chip Schweiger reminding you, keep your boots dry, your cinch tight, and remember, the further you ride into history, the more faces you begin to see. We'll see you down the road.